200 Lakota warriors stood in a silent arc around Amos Teller's ranch, their horses snorting clouds of breath into the Wyoming dawn. They were not there by accident. They came with purpose, their faces unreadable, hands gripping, offerings of silver, feathers, and hides. Amos stood frozen on his porch, his heart pounding, not knowing if this was gratitude or judgment. But to understand why they came, you have to go back to the storm, 24 hours earlier, when everything changed. If you are watching this on television, take a second to grab your phone and hit follow, like, or share. That one click means a lot, and it helps us keep telling stories that matter. Amos Teller rode hard through the blizzard, the wind screaming across the Bighorn foothills. Snow stung his face like needles, and his horse, Old Red, snorted with every step. The world was a white blur, visibility down to nothing. Amos pulled his hat low, cursing the storm. He was 42, weathered by years of winters like this one. But none felt as brutal as tonight. His ranch was close, maybe half a mile, but it might as well have been across the territory. He leaned into the wind, urging Old Red forward, thinking only of the warm stove waiting at home. His fingers ached inside his gloves, and the cold seeped through his coat, biting at his bones. Then he heard it. A faint cry, almost swallowed by the howling wind. Amos reined in, tilting his head. Was it his mind playing tricks? He had been out here too long, alone too long, since losing his daughter Ellie 10 years back in a storm just like this. The sound came again, sharper, desperate, a human voice. He turned Old Red toward it, his gut twisting. Who would be out in this mess? The snow swirled thicker, and he squinted, trying to make out shapes in the white chaos. His heart thudded, half from fear, half from something he couldn't name. He found her curled against a snowbank, a girl no older than 12, wrapped in a tattered blanket. Her lips were purple, her eyes half closed. A dead horse lay beside her, its legs stiff in the snow. Amos froze. She was Lakota. No question her braids, the beads on her blanket. The Lakota kept to themselves, wary of ranchers like him. He had heard stories of trouble, mistrust, even bloodshed. Helping her could mean risking his neck. Leaving her meant her death. He stood there, the wind howling, his breath catching as he saw Ellie's face in the girl's trembling form. He couldn't turn away. Amos hesitated, the wind biting through his coat. His daughter's face flashed in his mind. Ellie, lost to a storm like this. He could not let it happen again. He slid off Old Red, his boots sinking deep. He wrapped his heavy coat around the girl, her small frame shivering against him. The dead horse was too heavy to move, but he tied a rope to its saddle, dragging it toward his ranch. The girl was light as a feather, but the storm fought him every step. His muscles burned, his lungs stung with each icy breath, but he kept moving, muttering to himself, "Just get her safe." The wind roared, nearly knocking them over. Amos stumbled, his shoulder burning as he shielded her. Snow piled around his knees, each step a battle. He did not know if she was awake or gone, but he kept moving. When he finally saw the dim outline of his barn, he kicked the door open, collapsing inside with her. The smell of hay and horse sweat hit him as he laid her on a pile of blankets. She was alive, barely. He checked her pulse, his fingers clumsy from the cold, and saw her chest rise faintly. He dragged the dead horse's saddle inside, hoping it might mean something to her people. As he built a fire, Amos noticed something glinting on her chest. A silver necklace, carved with a crescent moon. His breath caught. He had seen that symbol before, in a letter from his wife Sarah, years ago, before she passed. Sarah had written about saving a Lakota child during a storm, giving her a necklace like that one. Could this be the same kid? His hands shook as he tucked the blanket tighter around her. He sat back, the fire crackling, and stared at the necklace. Memories of Sarah flooding back, her laugh, her stubborn courage, her stories of the plains. The girl stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She looked at him, lips trembling, and whispered something in Lakota. Amos did not understand the words, but the way she said them hit him hard. It sounded like father or home. His chest tightened. He had lost Ellie, lost Sarah, and now this kid was looking at him like he was someone who mattered. He did not know what to say, so he just nodded, stoking the fire. He grabbed a tin cup, filled it with water from his canteen, and held it to her lips. She sipped, her hands shaking, and he saw a flicker of trust in her eyes. Inside the barn, the fire's warmth slowly brought color back to the girl's face. Amos knelt beside her, checking her hands for frostbite. Her fingers were cold but pink, a good sign. He noticed a small pouch tied to her waist, half open, spilling polished stones etched with tiny symbols. He didn't touch them, but they looked sacred, like they carried a weight he couldn't understand. The barn creaked as the storm battered its walls, and Amos kept one eye on the door, expecting trouble. The Lakota would come for her. He knew it, but would they see him as a savior or a thief? He wrapped another blanket around her, his hands steady but his mind racing. The girl's breathing steadied, and she murmured something, her voice too soft to catch. Amos leaned closer, catching the word, Ahioka. Her name, he guessed. He repeated it softly, testing the sound, and her eyes flickered toward him, wide and searching. He gave her a small smile, the kind he hadn't used in years. Outside, the wind howled, but inside, the fire's glow felt like a fragile shield. Amos stood, stretching his aching back, and checked Old Red, who snorted softly in the corner. He patted the horse's flank, whispering, "We did good, old boy." But the necklace still nagged at him, tying this moment to a past he couldn't escape. Morning broke, gray and heavy, the storm finally easing. Amos planned to take the girl back to her people, but he did not know where to start. The Lakota camp was miles away, and he was not exactly welcome there. He was checking her fever when he heard it hooves, fast and heavy. He stepped outside, squinting into the cold. 10 Lakota riders crested the hill, their bows drawn, faces hard. One shouted, pointing at Amos, accusing him of stealing their chief's daughter. The air turned sharp, the riders' eyes burning with suspicion. Amos raised his hands, palms open, his heart thudding but his face calm. The lead rider, a tall man with a scar across his cheek, swung down from his horse, his bow still taut. "Where is Ahioka?" he demanded, his voice like gravel. Amos called into the barn, and she stumbled out, leaning on the doorframe, her blanket trailing in the snow. The rider's eyes softened at the sight of her, but Scarface's glare stayed fixed on Amos. He stepped closer, his arrow pointed at Amos's chest. "You took her," he said, spitting into the snow. Amos kept his hands up, his voice steady. "I found her dying. She's alive because of me." The words hung heavy, the silence thick with doubt. Ahioka raised her hand, her voice weak but sharp, cutting through the tension. She spoke in Lakota, pointing to the dead horse's saddle, then to the blanket around her shoulders. She gestured at the barn, her hands trembling but her eyes fierce. The riders listened, their bows lowering slightly. Scarface's jaw tightened, but he stepped back, muttering something to the others. Ahioka looked at Amos, her expression a mix of gratitude and defiance, like she'd just stood up for him in a way he couldn't understand. The riders exchanged glances, their hostility fading, but not gone. Scarface waved his hand, signaling Amos to follow. He didn't want to go, but Ahioka's small nod told him he had to. He helped her onto Old Red, her hands gripping the saddle weakly. The riders flanked them as they crossed the snowy plains, their horses' hooves crunching in rhythm. One rider, younger than the rest, kept glancing at Amos, his eyes narrow. "You saved her," he said, his voice low, "but you'll answer for touching her." Amos met his gaze, his jaw tight. He'd done what was right, but right didn't always mean safe. The necklace swung against Ahioka's chest, glinting in the pale light. At the Lakota camp, a crowd gathered, their whispers sharp as they watched Amos ride in. Chieftain White Elk stepped forward, his face carved with deep lines, his eyes cold but steady. He thanked Amos for saving Ahioka, but his tone carried no warmth. A young warrior, barely older than a boy, tossed a small bundle at Amos's feet, dried herbs tied with a red cord. "For your trouble," he said, his XX's eyes mocking. Amos picked it up, his fingers brushing the rough cord, but he stayed silent, feeling the weight of the camp's stairs. Ahioka tugged at her father's arm, whispering something in Lakota. White Elk's eyes flicked to her, then back to Amos. He nodded once, a curt gesture, and told Amos to leave. As Amos turned to go, Ahioka grabbed his sleeve, her eyes wet with tears. An elder stepped forward, his voice sharp as a blade. Amos had broken their law by saving a Lakota without permission. He said, it was a bad omen, a stain on their honor. To cleanse it, Amos must spend 3 nights in the open, facing the cold. Amos nodded, knowing peace with the Lakota was worth more than his pride. Ahioka slipped a small, etched stone into his hand, her fingers trembling. He closed his fist around it, its edges sharp against his skin. That first night, the wind cut through him like a knife. He sat huddled in a thin blanket, his breath clouding in the dark. Ahioka's silhouette appeared in the distance, clutching a bowl of stew, but a warrior blocked her path, his hand firm on her shoulder. Amos's fingers went numb, his thoughts drifting to Ellie, her laughter echoing in his memory. He had failed her, but he wouldn't fail Ahioka. He gripped the stone, its faint warmth a mystery in the freezing night. The carvings glowed softly under the moonlight, and for a moment, he swore he heard Sarah's voice, soft and fleeting, calling his name. He shook his head, blaming the cold for his wandering mind. The second night brought a lone wolf's howl, sharp and mournful across the plains. Amos shivered, his body aching. When an old woman approached, her face weathered like ancient rock, she dropped a leather pouch beside him without a word and vanished into the dark. Inside were dried berries and a single feather, tied with a thin thread. Amos stared, his fingers brushing the feather's soft edge. Was this kindness? A test? He ate the berries, their tartness waking his senses, and tucked the feather into his coat. The wolf howled again, closer, its cry stirring something deep in Amos's chest. A sense of being watched, not by an animal, but by something older, wiser. On the third night, Amos was a shadow of himself, his body weak, his vision blurred. He didn't see White Elk until the chief loomed over him, holding a silver necklace identical to Ahioka's. White Elk's voice was low, steady, recounting a woman who saved him from a snowdrift years ago, Sarah, Amos's wife. The chief hadn't known her name until now. Amos's knees buckled, the necklace cold in his hand but burning with meaning. White Elk's eyes softened, his hand resting briefly on Amos's shoulder. The gesture was small, but it carried the weight of a debt acknowledged, a bond forged in shared loss. White Elk led Amos to his tent, breaking every rule of their tradition. The air inside was warm, thick with the smell of sage and cedar. The chief poured tea, his hand steady, his eyes heavy with memory. He spoke of Sarah's courage, how she'd dragged him from the snow, her hand steady despite the storm. Amos listened, his throat tight, the steam from the tea curling around his face. Ahioka sat nearby, her eyes fixed on him, like he was more than a stranger. She reached out, her small hand resting on his, her touch light but heavy with trust. Amos's chest ached, seeing Ellie's eyes in hers, a ghost of the past made real. The next morning, Amos prepared to leave, his body worn, but his heart lighter. As he crossed a ravine on his way home, he spotted 6 white hunters crouched behind rocks, their rifles glinting as they eyed the Lakota camp. They whispered about stealing horses and supplies, their voices low and greedy. Amos tried to back away, but a twig snapped under his boot. The hunters spun, grabbing him, their ropes biting into his wrists as they tied him to a post. The leader, a wiry man with a crooked nose, pressed a pistol to Amos's temple. "You are with them, are not you?" he snarled. Amos stared him down, his voice steady. "You touch that village, you'll answer for it." A flicker of movement caught Amos's eye. A young Lakota scout, barely older than Ahioka, crouched in the trees. The boy's eyes were wide, but he raised a finger to his lips, then vanished. Amos's heart raced. Help was coming, but time was short. The hunter's pistol clicked, his grin cold. Amos leaned forward, his voice low. "You pull that trigger, you'll bring a storm you can't outrun." The hunter laughed, but his hand shook, doubt creeping into his eyes. Amos stood still, the ropes cutting into his wrists, his blood pounding in his ears. Hooves thundered, shaking the ground. White Elk and 20 warriors charged in, arrows slicing the air. The hunters scrambled, their shots wild, one splintering a tree near Amos's head. He twisted against the ropes, shoving Ahioka out of a bullet's path as it grazed his arm, blood soaking his sleeve. The warriors moved like a single force, their shouts echoing off the ravine walls. Amos tackled a hunter, pinning him in the snow, his own pain forgotten in the heat of the fight. Ahioka's scream cut through the chaos, her voice calling his name, sharp and desperate. When the dust settled, the hunters were gone, their gear scattered in the snow. White Elk cut Amos's ropes, his face unreadable but his hands steady. Ahioka ran to Amos, her arms wrapping around him, her breath hitching. The chief stepped forward, his voice carrying over the wind. He called Amos a guardian of honor, a title no outsider had ever earned. He draped a white wolf pelt over Amos's shoulders, its weight heavy with meaning. The warriors nodded, their silence a roar of respect. Amos stood taller, the pelt warming him, blood still dripping from his arm. On his ride home, Amos stopped by a frozen creek, its ice glinting under the weak sun. He pulled Ahioka's etched stone from his pocket, its carvings sharp against his fingers. Kneeling, he saw Sarah's face in the water's reflection, not grieving, but smiling, her eyes warm. He pressed the stone to his lips, its warmth steadying him, then tucked it away. The plain stretched wide before him, vast and quiet, and he rode on, the wolf pelt a promise against his back. He thought of Ellie, of Sarah, and for the first time, the pain felt less like a wound and more like a memory. At the ranch, Amos sat by his fire that night, the stone and feather on the table beside him. He traced the feather's edge, its softness grounding him. A soft knock came at the door, too soft for trouble. He opened it to find a Lakota woman, her hair streaked with gray, holding a woven basket. She said nothing, just handed it to him and left. Inside were dried corn, a small carved horse, and a note, in careful script. For the guardian. Amos's throat tightened as he held the horse, its wood smooth under his thumb. He set it beside Ellie's old doll, the two together like a bridge across time. Amos rode home, the pelt warm against the cold. He thought the story was over, that he could go back to his quiet life. But at dawn, the ground shook with the sound of hooves. He stepped onto his porch, his coffee mug slipping from his hand. 200 Lakota warriors surrounded his ranch, their horses forming a wide circle. Townsfolk gathered in the distance, whispering, afraid this was war. Amos's hand tightened on the porch rail, his eyes scanning the riders. Ahioka stood among them, her face calm but fierce, like she carried a secret he'd soon learn. White Elk rode forward, holding a bundle of eagle feathers and a leather pouch of silver. He raised his hand, and every warrior dismounted, their movements synchronized. They piled gifts at Amos's feet, blankets, furs, carved bows, food for months. Ahioka stood beside her father, her eyes bright. White Elk's voice boomed, saying Amos had not just saved his daughter, he had saved their honor. An elder stepped forward, placing a carved wooden staff in Amos's hands, its surface warm from the hands that shaped it. The townsfolk gasped, the air thick with awe, their fear giving way to wonder. The warriors knelt, heads bowed, a sight no one in the territory had ever seen. Amos's vision blurred, his hand resting on Ahioka's shoulder. He had lost his family once, but now, in this moment, he had found something new. Ahioka looked up, her smile small but steady, and handed him a single eagle feather. For your daughter, she said, her voice clear. Amos nodded, his throat too tight to speak, knowing Ellie's memory lived on in this moment. The townsfolk stood silent, their whispers stilled, as the story of the cowboy and the 200 warriors took root. As the warriors turned to leave, the young scout from the ravine lingered. He approached Amos, holding a small knife, its handle wrapped in leather. You fought for us, he said, his voice steady but young. Amos took the knife, its weight solid in his hand, and saw pride in the boy's eyes. The scout rejoined his people, and Amos stood alone on his porch, the gifts piled high, the feather catching the light. The legend would grow, but for Amos, it was enough to feel Ahioka's trust, to know he had done right by her, by Sarah, by Ellie. That evening, Amos walked to the edge of his land, where the plains met the sky. He held the eagle feather, its barbs soft against his fingers. A distant drumbeat carried on the wind, faint but steady, from the Lakota camp. He closed his eyes, letting the sound wash over him, and felt a warmth he hadn't known in years. The feather trembled in his hand, and he raised it to the sky, a silent vow to carry this bond forward. The stars above were sharp, like the carvings on Ahioka's stone, and Amos knew this story wasn't just his, it was theirs, woven into the land itself. If you are watching this on television, take a second to grab your phone and hit follow, like, or share. That one click means a lot, and it helps us keep telling stories that matter.